Hello, and welcome to Vermont College of Fine Arts Connection and Place Day of Lectures and Talks. I'm Silas Munro, Faculty Advisor and Chair Emeritus in the MFA in Graphic Design program at VCFA. I want to give a thanks to Matthew Monk, Academic Dean of VCFA, for the invitation today. Thank you for starting the MFA in Graphic Design program 9 years ago and asking me to go on this amazing ride with you and all the other faculty and students and alumni. I'm here today to share some research about W.E.B. Du Bois that is very close to my heart. It's close to my heart because it's about art and design, which I love. It's also close to my heart because it's about identity and humanity that transcends race, color, creed, gender, nationality, and sexuality. It's about using form to turn data into a kind of utopia, or at least the hope for utopia. The research I present today is collaborative and is the product of my contribution to W.E.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America, a book edited by Whitney Battle Baptiste and Britt Russard, who are scholars of Du Bois at UMass Amherst, where his papers are stored. There are additional essays by Mabel O. Wilson and Alden Morris, the foremost living Du Bois scholar. Our book is published by Princeton Architectural Press and came out in 2018. I'm going to channel RuPaul and say you can order it now on Amazon or buy it wherever fine books are sold. Speaking of plugs, I also want to signal boost the type design that you're going to see in this presentation you're currently looking at. It's designed by Trey Seals, who created Vocal Type. He is currently in the process of digitizing all of Du Bois type created from these diagrams into a font family called William. Speaking of wild rides, can I take you on a journey, one through time and space? I do need to give you a trigger warning that I'll be using historical terms that were appropriate for the time they were said, but conflict with our contemporary language. I also use humor, gallows humor really, in my talk to ground some of the darkness that I face in this work and research. So because we're going on a journey, I've prepared a menu. We're going to start with an amuse-bouche, the color line. We're going to go on to an appetizer called the Negro exhibit. The entree is a bit of a mouthful. It's two parts to the course. One, the Georgia Negro, and a series of statistical charts illustrating the condition of the descendants of former African slaves now in residence in the United States of America. For dessert, I'll be talking about my art and design history. And then to wash it all down, you'll have a digestive, which talks about the contemporary impact of this body of work. I'll talk about a project called Web. I'll talk about Trey Seals some more, and I'll talk about Esther Gates, and we'll end with the words of James Baldwin. Widely known to be a prolific author, renowned sociologist, fierce civil rights advocate, co-founder of the NAACP, and a historian of Black lives, W.E.B. Du Bois was also a pioneer of data visualization. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. This is one of Du Bois's most famous quotes. Published in his seminal Souls of Black Folk in 1903, it's a quote that cuts through the intersection of race and class. But he also mentioned this quote in a lecture in 1900, and that's an important date. It's also interesting to note that this notion of the color line actually was first coined by Frederick Douglass in some of his speeches, but it's Du Bois who actually takes that term and signal boosts and amplifies it into the discourse of what becomes civil rights. And this is Du Bois and his students at Atlanta University's work that gets expressed as a kind of visual color line, both literally and metaphorically. Because in 1900, Du Bois would explore this notion of the color line in a contribution of approximately 60 data visualizations or infographics to an exhibit at the Universal exposition in Paris, the World's Fair, dedicated to the progress made by African Americans since emancipation. And this, in French, Exposition des Négresses d'Amérique, or the American Negro. Working in ink, gouache, watercolor, graphite, and sprinkling of photographic prints, Du Bois and his student and alumni collaborators at Atlanta University generated crisp, dynamic, and modern graphics as a form of infographic activism. So now for our appetizer. So I'm going to talk more in depth about this Negro exhibit and how it came to be. So the American Negro exhibition was obviously involved Du Bois at the center of it, but it was actually organized by a man named Thomas Junius Calloway. He was a lawyer, educator, Fisk University graduate, and editor of the Colored American newspaper in Washington, D.C., who, with the endorsement and assistance of Booker T. Washington, who was W.E.B. Du Bois's frenemy, to put it lightly, petitioned the United States government to include in display of their industrial imperial prowess, as well as its commitment to social reform, an exhibit dedicated to African American life. The American Negro exhibit featured many contributions by students and faculty at the Tuskegee Institute, of which Booker T was associated with, Howard University, the Hampton Institute, and other Black colleges and industrial schools. Calloway had reached out to Du Bois, who was his former classmate and friend from Fisk, in the hope that he would be willing to contribute a social study about African American life to the exhibit. And that pairing of Booker T with Du Bois created a bit of a tension because Booker T comes from this perspective of Southern, agrarian, in Du Bois' eye, an accommodationist in terms of emancipation, and did not sit well with the Northern radical intellectual Du Bois. And actually, Du Bois also was quite critical of Booker T, who was like one of the most visible figures in civil rights and people of color, at least in terms of like a white audience in the United States. And Booker T of the Tuskegee Institute felt that like people of color should find a way to sort of like smooth over the relationship to the whites and focus on education, getting smart, you know, not just book smart, but practical jobs, the trades, agriculture, farming, engineering, etc. And so that's in big opposition to this figure of Du Bois, William Edward Burgert Du Bois, who his friends, he asked to call him Webb. This is a photograph of Du Bois in Paris in 1900 at the World's Fair where his data portraits were on display. Note the top hat. Not only was he brilliant, but he had baller headgear. He was born in 1868. This is 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation began to free slaves in America. And here is a quote where Du Bois is talking about himself, where he says, "In general thought and conduct, I became quite thoroughly New England." So he was raised by his single mother and grandma. He went to Fisk University in Tennessee, a historically Black college, then to Harvard for a second bachelor's, and eventually a PhD in sociology. He was the first Black man to do this. During the course of his graduate studies, he also studied abroad in Berlin, so he would have been familiar with Europe. Du Bois began assembling the exhibit on December 28, 1899. The Paris exhibition began on April 15, 1900, and the travel would take at least 6 weeks by ship. So Du Bois would not have very much time to assemble the exhibition. So after TJ made the invitation, Du Bois returned to his teaching post at Atlanta University, where he created the charts and enlisted both the women and men of color he taught to aid both in the gathering of data, but also in the graphic design and production. So in essence, the infographics were a product of multiple forms of collaboration and co-creation. Across the diagrams, there are many references to Atlanta University, and the lead infographic of the second series of images explicitly states that it was prepared and executed by Negro students under the direction of Atlanta University. At Atlanta University, William Andrew Rogers, who had recently received his bachelor's degree in sociology, was the point person responsible for making and coordinating the design and production of the actual graphics. Few records remain about the working methods of Rogers, who may have been living in Petersburg, Virginia when he worked on the project. Based on the volume of designs, each piece's complexity and detail, and the compressed project timeline of only a few months to prepare the portion of the American Negro exhibit, it seems implausible that Rogers and Du Bois worked alone to complete the project. Rogers and Du Bois no doubt facilitated renderings and typesetting from additional unnamed Atlanta University students and alumni who also were assisting with the collection of field data. I'm going to quote from Whitney Battle-Baptiste and Britt Russert's writing from the book, where they say the collaborative nature of work that went into the construction of the images, as well as their public exhibition, illuminate Du Bois' investment in true public sociology. Du Bois also turned to Atlanta alumni to construct a robust network of field researchers across the South. Black women were among the field researchers who contributed their expertise and labor to the Atlanta studies. We might further speculate on how white working class patrons touring the American Negro exhibit in Paris interpreted and made meaning of this data on their own terms. Here, both viewers of the infographics and Black study participants in the US come into view as legitimate co-producers of sociological knowledge. And here are photographs, or a photograph of Atlanta University students, some of which who might have been on Du Bois's team. Because Du Bois had to finish so quickly, he was stressed. In fact, in his own journals and accounts of working on the project, he said, the details of finishing these 50 or more charts and colors with accuracy was terribly difficult, with little money, limited time, and not much encouragement. I was threatened with nervous prostration before I was done and had little money left to buy passage to Paris, nor was there a cabin left for sale, but the exhibit would fail unless I was there. So at the last moment, I bought passage in the steerage and went over and installed the work. Russert and Battle-Baptiste further continue saying this image of Du Bois traveling across the Atlantic in steerage, in close proximity to the hold of the ship, does not sit comfortably with our own image of Du Bois as a cultural elite and famous intellectual, nor does it reflect the same vision of racial progress and modernity represented in the infographics themselves. So literally, it was easier for the graphics, the graphic design and the exhibition design to travel to Paris than it was Du Bois as a human being to get there, literally doing a kind of reverse middle passage to get to the exhibition. And so when he arrived, you picture it, this is Paris at the turn of the 20th century. It's the fin de silice. It's this getting out of your jury salons and dropping your Victorian cynicism, pessimism, and ennui. And the exhibit would be in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, which was built in 1885. This is a stereogram showing multiple views that you could put into a viewer and get this kind of augmented reality at the time view of the tower. This is now followed by an image of a souvenir print of the American Pavilion, which was a very Beaux Arts architectural style and also a prominent position as the US was arriving on the national stage. So it was situated near other prominent European powers, Germany, France, England. So this was a big moment for the United States in this kind of cultural context. Think of it as sort of like the Venice Biennale or Art Basel of the time. We now transition to a floor plan of the Palace of Social Economy, which is where Du Bois's exhibit was. It was just sort of like a bit of a trade show kind of vibe happening here. You can see in this map there are Equitable Life Assurance Society, Leave for Social Service. You have the American Library Association, And then you also have Prudential Life Insurance Company outside of the space. In the corner, in like not the most ideal position, was the Negro exhibit. I mean, there was nothing really auspicious about the space, but the exhibit needed to have this kind of sparkle of originality and will require the imaginative resourcing and resonance to give visitors pause to marvel at this display. And this is no small task given the heavy content of the exhibition. So Du Bois would need to actually break the mold of what you would expect for a sociology exhibition, which was often these like tabletop dioramas. And they ended up winning a gold medal to Du Bois for his role as the collaborator and compiler of the materials for the exhibit. Here you can see a installation view of the exhibition. So instead of relying on this diorama or tabletop model presentation, often used at the World's Fair during this time, Du Bois and his team used this information design as a kind of rhetorical device. Extant photo documentation shows that at least half of the present diagrams were mounted in wing frames set on movable standards that allowed fairgoers to flip through large double-sided plates of the rich data at eye level. So these diagrams weren't just like pinned up into a wall, they were on this haptic information display that really was a form of experience design and included all of the contributions that were mentioned earlier by students and faculty at Tuskegee, Howard, Hampton, and many other Black colleges and industrial schools. So the idea was that patrons would be able to be informed about this sort of education and uplift that was happening in African American communities across the South. It featured an eclectic set of objects. There were images, texts, framed photographic portraits of prominent African American leaders and politicians, tools, harnesses, and other agricultural products. That's definitely Booker T's touch, right? And of course, a bronze statuette of Frederick Douglass. You can see it on the left of the image, as well as an on-site collection of over 250 publications authored by African Americans. And one of the photo frames actually was carved by a former slave. So you can see Douglass's color line, like physically, literally coming into the space of Du Bois's exhibit. Here's the gold medal award that Du Bois and his team won. And then the exhibition had the second life where it actually went back to the United States and toured, packed up, shipped, and displayed at a number of other World's Fairs and expositions back in the United States, including speaking to African Americans in America after this international debut. So, for example, a group of Black club women worked to bring the exhibit to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901, and this is the souvenir from that. And it's clear that Du Bois continued to think about the infographics he and his team prepared, because in 1909 he wrote Callaway to ask if he could return the exhibition from the Library of Congress, where the artifacts and documents had been deposited and then scanned and digitized and put on the internet in 2016, 2017, hence their reemergence from a kind of loss in history. Speaking of history, we need to back up from 1900 to 1899 when the process of the plates and diagrams was started. And I'm going to actually now really take you into the meat and potato, or tofu and potatoes of this meal, if you would. So the plates were in these two highly distinct but related sets. So on the left, we have the Georgia study. And then on the right, we have this longer title, which was based on national data rather than state-based data. Both sets use a range of visual strategies, including geographic maps, circle and spiral diagrams, bar and area charts, and complex tables and grids, giving a vivid variety to the data. As mentioned before, there are multiple instances across the two sets to Atlanta University. And so the team was split up and took similar subjects such as education, colorism, and economic class and reproduced them twice with different visual structures. So there was a kind of iteration happening because of this compressed timeline and the fact that these were sociologists not trained in graphic design. Going to the first plate, you can see Du Bois and his students open up the visualizations with this striking map that captures the sweeping nature of their study. You can see two circles connected by fine lines that track dark areas of Africa to equally dark swaths of the United States, the Caribbean, and South America. You can see a solitary star that represents Atlanta, citing the source of the study and giving context of the transatlantic slave trade, which was part of Du Bois's PhD dissertation at Harvard, was the systemic nature of the slave trade. But in this case, in the plate, he's giving it visual form. And Mabel O. Wilson's essay speaks to this more in depth in the book. But my visual interpretation of what is happening here is through design, Du Bois and his collaborators were able to trace from the slave trade through the Middle Passage to emancipation and beyond, using this unique visual form to make arguments for the equality and sophistication of Black Americans living under Jim Crow and the shadow of enslavement. And you can see this detail where the study is being framed as this list of evidence. And one of my favorite things is the last thing. They say, series of charts, maps, and other devices. I think that's so cool. This whole body of work is like an other device, and you can see that famous quote about the color line printed there before the Souls of Black Folks, 3 years before it. And here's the title plate of the second set, which to me is designed as a proclamation in type and image form. It's one of the most dense of all the plates. It's also the most self-referential, where you can see this declaration that this is this collective effort. And the palette to me is so remarkable. This palette of gouache and bright colors that connects to the color palette of the Georgia study, but also has this strategic mix of typographic families and styles. Here, the principal type appears to be a sans serif or grotesque typeface, which predates the 20th century. But if you look closer, inspection reveals that the dominant letter style used in the charts have no curves, only straight lines, and is more akin to lettering generated by templates designed for architectural or engineering plans. Based on the author's training in sociology rather than graphic design, it would make sense for the Atlanta University students to have used some templates and pre-existing tools. The residue of technical lettering, most likely from an American architectural lettering template, is especially visible in the lighter weights of the hand-rendered type utilized for French translations, evidence in the non-standard weight of heavier diacritic marks, in this case, the accents. So this was a template that was made in the United States or England, and so Du Bois and his team were customizing things on the fly, and you can see a lot of variation in these punctuation marks. Made a decade before the rise of dominant European avant-garde movements, these works predate modular design elements often considered to have their origins in Russian constructivism, Gestalt, and Italian futurism. And the details, the choices that are made by the designers have this very emotional, powerful, rhetoric expression. Just look at that tattered edge on the left, which at first glimpse I was like, oh, did the maker have too much coffee because they were on a deadline? But no, this is like this visceral uh, manifestation of the tearing of flesh into this kind of graphic representation. This plate about Negro teachers in Georgia public schools is really groundbreaking for its simplicity. These modular elements are typically composed of abstract shapes built from circles, triangles, and rectangles, and bright primary colors are black and white. You can see these amazing details in terms of color being used within figures, variations in weights to the type. And to me, I can't not see that and not think about Herbert Bayer's Universal Alphabet from 1925. So this is 25 years before this, but has the same kind of modularity. And, we can sort of credit Bayer with this sort of father of Bauhaus typography, but he had precursors that, predate and were in Europe. Bayer was quite young as a Bauhaus master, but Kandinsky could have been old enough to attend the fair. So who knows about connections between the fair itself and other movements of European avant-garde happening after the exposition. So this is 20 years before Gropius wrote his original manifesto for this German art and design school, famous for its rigorous foundation that was connected to this idea of modular design elements. And when I zoom in on this pie chart, modified pie chart, you see this like expressiveness that makes me think of the famous color test that Kandinsky would give his students at the Bauhaus, where a certain platonic shape, a square, triangle, or circle should be a particular color, red, blue, or yellow. And then if you didn't have it correct, it was wrong. And what's interesting about this form of a chart is that Du Bois wasn't creating this out of nowhere. He would have been informed and known about someone like William Playfair, who is a Scottish statistician who actually created the modern pie chart. And that this chart shows a representation of the statistical population of the United States of America. This is made 100 years before Du Bois, but because of his learning both at Harvard but also abroad, would have been definitely influenced by Playfair, who was actually a Scottish engineer who became this data visualization founding father, I guess, at least in terms of like the Western canon. And then another possibility model for Du Bois would have been Florence Nightingale, who was actually a nurse in the British Army, who created her own class of diagram that was an extension of the pie chart called the polar diagram or the rose diagram, which she created in 1859 as part of the Crimean War as a form of infographic activism to convince the British government to provide more medical supplies. And so you can even see like a color palette connection to the Du Boisian plates. The colors, shapes, and typography of the charts also foreshadow critical developments in the history of data visualization, including simplified pictographic form defined in the isotype picture language, which was created by Otto and Marie Neurath and Gerhard Ernst in Vienna, in the mid to late 1920s. So this predates that. This diagram that, you can't get much more direct and accessible than, a bag of cash being a basic emoji, or pictographic for this chart. And this is a great example of ways in which Du Bois and his team tried to deal with things that were quite complex. So this idea of colorism, or this idea of like class and skin tone within Black culture, had a representation that was in the Georgia data set, which is a bar chart represented here, which again echoes back to this like lovely, not lovely, but like considerate and kind of moving representation of color to talk about sort of the price of human trafficking that has continued to show up in racial discrimination after emancipation, and then contrasted that with national data about colorism. And then if you look at them side by side, you can really start to see the distinctions, not only in terms of chart type, but also typographically. You can see that this stencil lettering template starts moving to letterpress, because my sense is their timeline was they didn't have the same people working on the same sets and also had to speed things up. So the dates are using the same typographic references, but the titles, I think, were one-off letterpressed as a kind of machine engineering to speed up these one-off posters. Here we see a chart of Negro businessmen in the United States, which to me looks like an abstract painting, a monochrome painting we would see like in mid-20th century. And you can see this typographic eclecticism that starts creeping into the set, where these two different types of lettering are merging, letterpress on the left and top, and the engineering lettering in the middle. And you can also see in this plate 40, like this whole other kind of set of typographic languages, small caps happening to the template, and then what looks like the penmanship, probably of one of his students, with this sort of italic-ish, upright italic capitals. This chart really blows me away, this assessed value of household and kitchen furniture owned by Georgia Negroes, which really, to me, references the international typographic style. Not only that, but like also is its own chart type. It's not a bar chart and it's not a pie chart. It's this Du Boisian spiral, which has this beautiful graphic language that doesn't look too dissimilar from a Joseph Mueller Brockman poster from 1955. And the complexity and the variation goes on. Like, this work is not anywhere in the body of research of Edward Tufte, who is one of our foremost scholars of data visualization, which speaks to the erasure, systematic erasure, both by sociology, but also graphic design history of this work. Part of that had to do with the fact that these were one-offs presented in Europe and in select locations in the United States, and then archived in the Library of Congress for years. Look at the innovation of these diagrammatic formats. But a great deal of why we don't or didn't know about these in a more prominent way until recently is racism, is the systematic erasure of Du Bois' research by his colleagues in sociology, as well as a sort of ignoring from wider press, both in Europe and in the United States. Here you can see a stark black and white diagram for illiteracy that has this kind of woven Du Boisian language. And all of this came together in such a thoughtful synthesis of different approaches in this last plate that I'll show you, which is about income and expenditure of Negro families in Atlanta, Georgia. Although Du Bois and his team were hardly the first to visualize data with this level of rigor in the pre-computation era, these designs are unique and important. The rhetorical the rhetorical innovation in the social sciences, coupled with a visual aesthetic very much at home in the 21st century, makes for a prescient body of work. And you can even see when you zoom in to this plate, the direct instructions to the viewer to raise the frame to see the statistics on the back. That brings me to dessert. So we're going to hear about my design history. I wish I could end with Du Bois, but I really need to talk about why there is this systemic gap in this knowledge and part of my own complicitness in this and also a way to break free. So my first design history teacher was a man named Doug Scott, who I jokingly call Silver Fox Scott, and my second design history teacher, Lorraine Fierce Wild. These were amazing design educators and designers who had pretty amazing pedigree. They would have been familiar with Philip Meggs, author of the first canonical text on graphic design history, which is still a mainstay today. Both of them were educated at Yale in the MFA program in graphic design, so they would have had the influential designer Paul Rand as an educator, not a historian, but influential in sort of shaping the discourse around graphic design history through his writing that is more about sort of design and culture and his own sort of weighty practice as a designer. Other American faculty like Bradbury Thompson, and then of course like the category of European faculty that would become a centerpiece of Lorraine Wild's seminal Europeans in America, talking about the emigre of the avant-garde to the United States. They also would have known of Lou Danziger, who was teaching in California nearby Lorraine and was the first person really in America to teach a survey course in graphic design history at Art Center, College of Art and Design, also in Los Angeles. And as far as Lorraine, also was mentored by Kathy McCoy at Cranbrook in their short period of having an undergraduate program in graphic design. And so I'm kind of just like, well, what's missing here in this particular grouping of design historians, of which now there are many more as well that we could add to this. But part of, I think, what's lacking is, and this has changed in terms of how, at least Doug and Lorraine now teach, but kind of coming from this framework of design as this kind of modernist celebrity clothesline, where it's just this timeline of famous, mostly white, mostly European, and mostly male names, right? That or unnamed, right? From cuneiform all the way to April Greiman in 1983, which is sort of where the original edition of Meggs ends, and a lot of history courses don't really get out of the 80s or talk about it in a very significant or thoughtful way. But you could have other models. So one of the models I propose is sort of this nodal historical network where you choose your family, right? So you could think of connections like Herbert Bayer, who was mentioned earlier, and his teacher, Walter Gropius, having that kind of bond between each other, or Josef Müller-Brockmann and Max Bill as kind of contemporaries in a Swiss milieu of graphic design, even though their approaches and philosophies varied from each other. You could think of Karl Gerstner and Armin Hoffman as colleagues, a kind of like string theory where like I get to pick Du Bois, if I want to be part of my family, which is great, but still kind of doesn't address this kind of major minor discrepancy in design history. And so my latest model is sort of thinking about a more intersectional and relational way, a kind of responsive discourse where once you introduce Du Bois into the dialogue, you can kind of reshift what's considered significant or impactful, or even like first, in terms of accuracy. And you could take that framework and apply that to a whole curriculum of design history or syllabi or a textbook, which I'm working on, which is you could take, say, a lecture about streamlining and the American automobile, and you can add to the lens of Victor Hugo Green's Negro Motorist Green Book, and you could explore the nature of planned obsolescence developed by the American automobile industry that shapes the modern condition of craving the new, and how that operated in tandem with exclusionary urban building and political policy that made the utopian visions of World's Fairs and Art Deco unavailable to marginalized populations in America. Or you could remodel the late 1960s Eames lounger chair, which is sort of this representation of a certain population leaning, reclining, chilling in their offices, which was released in 1968, which is the same year that the Memphis sanitation worker strike was happening, the same night that Dr. King was assassinated, where you have working people literally like walking through refuse, marching for their own jobs and lives. And that's also happening at the same time as Tadanori Yoku's exhibition, a Japanese graphic designer at MoMA. And that's also the same time as the Haight and Ashbury hippie modernism stuff that's happening. So this idea that you don't have a singular history, that you can have a polyphonic or many histories happening simultaneously. And that leaves me with your digestif to wash all this down. I know that's sort of a lot to kind of take on, where we can see the contemporary impact of a kind of liberation, social liberation through graphic design. One of those being the type you've been seeing here, and the studio of Vocal Type led by Trey Seals. This is his website, and a early specimen of William from last year that's being used in this presentation. This was a contemporary project that I did with students at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and took Du Bois's framework of data, but the students explored Philadelphia, which is one of the most segregated cities in the United States, to reconfigure their relationship to their city by taking new visualization to data sets and telling a more diverse, more inclusive narrative of the city that they were going to school in and living in and operating, everything from police-involved shootings, crime mapping in ethnic districts, as well as hate crimes and extremism. So trying to find a way to use this utopian framework to deal with the shadow of things that are happening in the world now. And, also people like Theaster Gates, a contemporary artist who took Du Bois's diagrams and then abstracted them and turned them into these really beautiful silkscreen paintings on aluminum, where the data is sort of stripped away and the graphics themselves are honored in this sort of pantheon of modernism and abstraction in a way where they weren't even considered, even known of. And Theaster then also took this work and created a series of neons as well, which really transform and transmute this work into yet another form of expression and social commentary. Speaking of social commentary, I'll now close with a digestive, a bitter drink to wash it all down with, which comes in the form of a quote from James Baldwin, questioning even the nature of the history of history. He says, on the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. Thank you so much. We will follow this with a Q&A discussion with Dr. Dori Tunstall, Dean of Design at OCAD University in Toronto.
Story you're telling and how you're contextualizing it, both in terms of like the history of graphic design, but also sort of, again, sociology and the history of representation of Black folks here and there.
Yeah, it's definitely that research and writing cracked open something really big for me. And just the sort of like reframing of things in terms of what was missing, and just it was just so confirming to have a lineage. Right? Do you know what I mean? Like so, and I didn't realize how much I was missing it until I started to find it, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. It's kind of like when I discovered Zora Neale Hurston as an anthropologist, right? Like, okay, so the way I'm feeling about the field and the way it positions me, in some ways oppositional to the field, right? Like my identities, there's a precedence for that. And that means there's other strategies that I can take in terms of how I represent myself, but also how I represent the kind of work that I want to do in a field that has, again, problems, right, with community.
To say the least.
And so, yeah, so it's they're being able to sort of open the space of me existing in a field, and to do so with a sense of like authenticity. Like the opening of that possibility was really powerful for me when I've discovered, that there's, there's others who've walked this path before me, and I don't have to dig a path from scratch.
I remember reading Their Eyes Were Watching God. I'm pretty sure that was high school. And I had a similar sensation as you then too. I didn't realize it would be, eventually connected to like what my field would be. But there is something about the language, like the way she languages that novel that is really confirming, just the sounds, in her text that she embeds in there. It's very much like what you were saying about, wait, isn't all vernacular black women vernacular? Like the cycle going from, Black women's experience, trans women of color, then queer people in general, and then like everyone else.
Yes, girl.
Yes, girl. Wait a second, where's that coming from? Amazing.
One of the things I thought was really interesting, well, and you could tell me a little bit about this, is that what was really interesting in your talk was that you're kind of trying to make these bridges between the work that was done collaboratively by, the collective and the students and all those sort of things surrounding Du Bois. But you were always trying to connect it to things that you felt the audience would resonate with. So it's like, oh, this is like Kandinsky, and this is like whatever.
Yeah.
Like that. And it was really interesting to sort of to watch that and then to sort of like ask the question, like, how would you do your talk differently if you were speaking to, I don't know, like the Hue Design Summit of nothing but other Black designers? Like what would the kind of connections you would make, would the references be different? Would the assumptions about what it is that they know and they don't know be different? Because it was a thing for me. And again, it's like I'm in graphic design enough that I was like, okay, I know this was Spasmo School, or I know all these sort of things, or I know like I can, it's a thing, but I was just like, but that's not me.
Well,
I mean, I know these things, I know the genealogies, I know the people who practice, but it's like, but that's not my genealogy.
Yeah. I think part of what I was doing there, and also what I did in my text, was I felt this pressure to legitimize boys. I think that's what that was about. And also me being just shocked that this body of work existed basically for a century plus. I mean, it was seen some places, but it didn't really get the recognition that it deserved until a century later. And so I was just so gagged. I mean, literally gagged. Like that I was like, oh my God, these are amazing. Yeah, it was sort of part of this like shock of not knowing. And I'm like, how I had amazing design history teachers, but like you said, like my lineage wasn't reflected and I didn't realize how much it was missing. And then, so it just seemed to make sense, like, oh God, this is 20 years before the Bauhaus, like, duh, or before Russian constructivism, before Gestalt, before Eichstätt, all these things that are considered pantheon in terms of graphic design with a capital GD. And sort of like tying these things, my experience, a Black experience, something from the African diaspora, into design pedagogy. But I think if I was speaking to a Black audience, and this has also been part of my own re-education. And you mentioned Zora Neale Hurston, who was one of the authors in this publication, Fire, you know, which is this queer Black Harlem Renaissance publication that has Langston Hughes and Brad Nugent and so many different people in there. And I don't know, I guess what I'm starting to do is like, the dialogue between my lineage is becoming more important than the dialogue between sort of a Black vernacular potentially and like a major discourse. I'm very interested in like, how does Langston Hughes connect to Baldwin, you know? Like kind of the interconnections within Blackness, within queerness. That's what I would start talking about, and that's what I'm diving into more now in my research.
But still, how would you tell that story differently? Like if you're in a cocktail party with all like your super amazing Black queer folks, and you're explaining
it would definitely be much more fabulous.
Explaining this project, like how would you talk about it? Like how would you? You know, what were some of the gaps in it, right? Did the project address queerness in the Black community?
Fire or Du Bois?
Du Bois.
Well, he didn't, and I think he's homophobic, to be honest. So that's kind of like, now I'm discovering, like, oh, like he was at the same salons as Nugent and Hughes, you know, in DC and Harlem, but like, his whole thing about the Black arts movement was like, he was so against it. He was like, artists shouldn't have like put their personal expression in things. He was such a rational, cerebral person that he was very nonplussed about the queerness, which is like strange. So then how do you hold these two lineages together? Like there's homophobia within the Black community and there's racism outside and inside the community. There's like, you know, a bias towards things that are masculine. You know, there's a misogyny, right, in the queer community, and a anti-femme quality. So I think
they're all messed up. We are, and it's a thing where what we learn, right, when we begin to try to tell the stories of our histories and trying to tell those connections is that we are still caught in sort of these dominant paradigms, and then there's almost more work to be done to find, like, hey, what's the even more marginal voice in this marginality, right? And then, and it's not like, like these things don't exist, what's the mechanisms by which they were not brought to the fore? But then you always figure out, like, again, like somebody was documenting it. Someone was doing it in some way.
Right.
So then how do you bring the interconnections, right, between those conversations that kind of just miss each other? Like, how do you bring them together, right? To especially if you're trying to represent a holistic picture of a community as diverse as the Black community.
I mean, I think the salon is actually a great format for that. Not necessarily, I mean, well, either salon, the salon where you get your hair done, or did, as I like to say.
It did.
Or the precursor to that, which is, getting in someone's living room, holding space, and cutting up, getting into it. And I think that's also what I'm
thinking. I mean, like I've been engaging with a lot of individuals who, because we've been doing a lot of stuff around diversity, inclusion, and OCAD, and I've been engaging with a lot of people on the autism spectrum. And one of the things I'm realizing in my engagement with them, like, is how, like, even our, like, I'm super verbal. And for someone who's on the autism spectrum, I'm a disaster. Well, no, I mean, in the sense that, because I'm very verbal, my language is suffused with lots of poetic, metaphorical language that's not very straightforward and plain. And so it's a thing where it's like, when I engage with either students or faculty or whatever who are on the spectrum, I have to, like, shift the whole entire way in which I speak. And and even in some ways, use, let's say, the whiteboard more to diagram out what it is that I'm trying to sort of say, so that I create a space for them to enter into dialogue with me, right? And so again, thinking about like even the format of the salon, where like the lights are really low, like whatever, the hookah's going, whatever it is, like again, within that, there's a modality of being an intellectual, which is part of that framework, which in some ways is like ignores a lot of intellectual production that happens by those who cannot survive or thrive well in that modality. And it's just getting me to say, because like I love gathering people, but it's made me think about the ways in which my preferences for gathering people is actually quite exclusionary for some people that I think are brilliant, and I would love to be able to engage them, right?
Because they're not verbal?
Well, it's not that it's that, again, it's like there's people who think better, let's say, in pictures, right? Or there's people or who you can better connect with through like the co-making of things or something, right? And so for me, it's just a matter of thinking through, like again, my bias is very much a verbal one, even though like I'm highly visual as well, my bias is verbal, and just kind of being aware of the way in which I create situations in which, like, again, other people can't thrive in those environments, right? Because everyone is using highfalutin metaphorical languages steeped with poetics, right? That then it's like, well, if you're a person who is very rational and linear in your thinking, like that you can't enter into that space. And again, I'm flexible enough that I can sort of adapt, right? But that's not how I organize, let's say, a gathering or a happening, right?
Yeah, I'm wondering if maybe like a dinner party could also be another format too, where it's kind of, I don't know, I think for me, just to kind of answer your question more, my thing with facilitation and sort of like speaking to an audience that has maybe more of a experience, the subject matter. I kind of feel this with all groups, but it's like, I'm not the expert. So like, how do I create a space where everyone is resourced in a way to whatever degree they feel available and capable? And so I love that idea of like other formats too. Like, I think that's why I like workshops, you know, and this idea, that's, I think a lot of my ideas around how to reconfigure history or design history is so graphic. Like the diagrams, that part of it is really important to me. This idea of like, how do you visualize these overlaps or interconnections? And I think that for me was just like a tool to be like, oh, it is really possible to reframe these discourses. And, but like how to do that in a way that doesn't like talk down, you know, or kind of like push away is something I grapple with a lot.
One of the things was really interesting when I was doing my work, like with Design for Democracy, and I was teaching in a class on governmentality at University of Illinois Chicago. And so in the class, again, a bunch of design students, we did a lot of work around, again, it was based on Foucault. So, and again, his notions of like when statistical analysis sort of enters the discourse of governance, right?
Yes.
And what I always find really interesting is that that there's a way in which, like, if you think of what Du Bois was doing, what you think of what Florence Nightingale was doing, and all of it's that actually the use of statistics in and of itself was meant to be sort of superstructures of oppression.
Yes.
But the visualization of it, the data visualization of it, seems to have always come from this activist mode, right? And maybe it's part of like the democratization of that information. So it's like, okay, you may not be able to understand these charts and numbers, but I will give you an image that will help you enter into what these numbers actually mean so that you can act, right? That you can act upon these numbers in ways that will change, hopefully, the conditions in which these numbers are operating for a group of people. And that sort of came back to me when I was watching your presentation, was the fact that actually the visualization of data, and now I'm trying to remember, there's one book I probably have somewhere, because when I was teaching that, like I said, there was I was pulling from a lot of different materials, and there was one book that was on sort of data visualization, but like in the 1900s, because I was reading it in relationship to the Foucault stuff. And it was, again, it was really fascinating in terms of being clear about what data was being left out.
Yeah.
And then also being clear, like, and then showing when that data came in and how it shifted kind of policy, or how, and so there was a direct relationship between, in some ways, the call to account for certain experiences visually in the data, but also the changes in policies and positionings that then was possible because people could see that information, right? Could see that data. Now I have to go find that book. It's
Yeah.
gonna bother me now, because that was the thing where it's like, it didn't.
To me later. But I that really resonates. I'm glad you're bringing up Foucault and data and the sort of what's in the archive, and the power dynamics around that. And I'm paraphrasing him, but basically he was saying that the sign of a truly democratic nation is access to the archive of data. Like the more access there is, the more healthy and democratic a nation or institution is, which is like strikingly resonating with this whole COVID stuff, and like how all of the data about cases are really coming from like newspapers and journalists and like scientists. They're not coming from like our government. You know, like
Your government.
Sorry, that's why I said our. I didn't say yours. Our government, at least here in the States, and just kind of how that dynamic of what's sequestered and what has access has a power dynamic. And the reason why I'm thinking about Foucault is that I'm at the beginning of reading this book called Porn Archives, just from 2014, which is all about like scholarship around the relationship between pornography and archives, and even just the definition of something that's considered illicit or inappropriate comes from the 18th, 19th centuries, where it literally took both centuries to uncover the ruins in Pompeii, and how as part of the uncovering, they found all of these sculptures and drawings of giant phalluses, which in Pompeii were like out in the public and were part of like just general art.
Like fertility.
Fertility, yeah, exactly. Fertility models. And then how the researchers at the time, as like morals were shifting, were like, ooh, these should be saved, but we can't save them out everywhere else. And they got put away, you know, in this museum, with secret museum, and were uncovered later. So it's weird that their erasure is actually what preserved them. And their significance. And I'm just thinking a lot about the Du Bois drawings as being these things that were one-offs that had a very public circulation at the turn of the century, and were very accessible visually, but also like haptically and in space where people could really encounter and engage them, but then were sequestered to the Library of Congress where no one had access to them, and they were kind of secret for a long time. And then this digital exposing of it like made their significance change and shifted like all these things. And so that's making me think about the sort of queer dynamic within the Black community as this kind of black box. It's like this taboo thing. And so as I'm uncovering it, it is really like reconciling all that's happening. And Tim Dean, the author of this essay that I've been reading, was also talking about the weird flip side of like our digital archives, where suddenly every image can have metadata, and the archive is so porous and available that it kind of flips the thing where each image actually, it has a portable archive with it, you know? And so I think now the Du Bois drawings, now that they're kind of like coming out, and like all these other things that I'm interested in are suddenly like have the potential to shift the entire archive. And so potentially what I'm seeing in terms of like my research around this is like, I'm writing a text just because it sort of makes sense for like a history class, and I'm doing it through a reader, but like text isn't enough. Like, you know, audio material, visual material, like there's kind of, I don't know, I'm excited about like, that is also a disruptive element, and maybe like a queer element. It's like not like a fixed thing. Like how do you design or write or create a narrative that has flux in it?
Well, again, I mean, that's the thing that the digital, like we're going back to a pre-literate society.
Yeah.
I mean, like seriously, like it's a thing where it's like, if I wanted to, I could totally use, you know, the internet purely by voice. Siri, get me whatever. And then tell me what the answer is, right? Yeah. You might even show me what the answer is, right? So I could completely operate pretty functionally. And again, like at a high level of like intellectual power, because we normally sort of assign sort of, I mean, there's a lot of people who are not literate, right, and live their lives every day, but we assign a sort of intellectual acumen to a certain amount of literacy, right? That you could pretty much operate now through all the digital resources that are available without reading text.
Yeah, that it's actually read to you, and then there's all these other overlayers. So it's interesting because like I'm also, since we've been like working together, somehow my ears are open. Like when I was in Texas, like I was hearing a piece about First Nations, their relationship to place and their relationship to narrative. It was actually an ecologist who was talking about this, and and he was talking about the sort of connections between ecologists and what he was coming to understand as First Nation principles, and this idea of like how almost like science, and I would say in kind of what you're saying about like oral voice and technology, is like finally catching up to things that have been quite ancient and been around sort of since our beginnings. And this idea of like a timeless time, or a kind of memory that's embodied and ephemeral and not necessarily encoded in a codex. So I just thought that was what you were saying about that. There does seem to be a kind of return to conditions that came before all of this colonial crap.
Colonial crap has been really bad. And it's hard, right? Because, you know, again, like, okay, you said like, okay, magic time wheel, we're gonna get rid of colonization. It's like, that means you get rid of jazz and you get rid of, you know, like African-American culture disappears without colonization. It is a, not even a byproduct, it's a direct product of sort of resiliency of a people's in the face of colonization. That's totally new. Like it's bricolage, or it's a sort of a hybridity of different things, but it's totally new. The things that exist in those cultures never existed before in their original home places, right? So you would have to give that up, right?
Yeah, that's true. I'm not willing to give up jazz. Or bricolage, you know? Yeah. And I think maybe that's sort of like, could be an interesting strategy for design history, you know? And I mean, I think the diagrams from Du Bois are a kind of form of collage, and it's also really interesting to highlight, and this is something that I think needs further research, is the labor of Black women, particularly in the making of the diagrams themselves.
There's some fine hand skills.
You know, it wasn't just the guys at Atlanta University that were working on this. And,
yeah, but again, you have to, I mean, but again, you have to remember, like, okay, the assertion of sort of patriarchy in the Black community is merely the assertion of a form of white supremacy.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is that during slavery, Black men and women were equal. Like they equally did the labor, they equally were abused sexually and other ways. They were equally likened to be sold off. They were equally able to derive, you know, secondary incomes from their crafts or their talents and things like that. So there was a built-in sort of equality of oppression that happens in as part of like that colonization and that enslavement, right? Mm-hmm. It is only in the emancipation that then these structures of Black patriarchy become really important to defining what it means to be a free man, right? And that free man is still based on a model of that white man. He just has different skin tone, right? And so within that, that's where you then get the heavy assertion of a sort of a patriarchy, which then tries to push the women down to like, no, you shouldn't be going out and earning an income if you don't have to, because I'm trying to aspire to be a middle class, affluent Black man. You stay at home and take care of the children to live up to this white notion of domesticity, right? That, and again, in even one would say in our social relations under enslavement, there was, in terms of like your gendered preferences and sort of things, like there weren't hard and fast rules, right? Because you didn't own your body. You didn't have that. Every sexual act was an act of rebellion, right? Against a system in which you didn't even own your own body. So that even sense of like prohibitionist in terms of like your sort of fluidity of sexual relations, right? Because you could be ordered to have sexual relations, men with men and women with women and all these sort of things. Like so even in that reestablishing of a sort of homophobia, right, which comes from the Christianity aspect of like that colonization and enslavement, that even then that reasserts itself only in that how we're going to be emancipated people and how do we earn the respectability politics, how do we earn the respect of white men, because they still don't care about white women, white men.
Right, exactly.
In such a way that this can help, quote unquote, uplift the race, right? But all of that pre-stuff, like pre-emancipation, there was a lot more, like I said, fluidity, right? There was definitely equality, and there was a lot more fluidity. But it only, again, the necessity of reasserting a certain patriarchal notion came with emancipation for Black folks, and then further oppression.
Yeah, right.
So I mean, and maybe things like emancipation meant emancipation for like heterosexual Black men.
Yeah,
right?
exactly, right.
And then everyone else had to fall in line, supposedly, in order to be able to protect the respectability politics of that entity as an equal to, or an aspiring equal to, a sort of white male, heterosexual, patriarchal figure.
Which is very much what Du Bois was, crafting himself into, the talented 10th, this using intellectual acuity and education as a means to bootstrap his status and position in society and in the world, and writing and publishing as a way to further things. I mean, there's a lot of problems with him, but then there's also so much innovation as well too. So I think maybe we can kind of close with that. Like, I'm just sort of curious about, now the Q&A is kind of turning, like, how do you hold space for, like what you were mentioning with jazz, like the tensions between the darkness, the hate, patriarchy, white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, all these, how do you hold space for these opposing energies, in a reclaimed or healed or transformed or evolved history or account of
well, it's kind of the thing that we said we talked about before, where it's like I'm positioned within the struggle, and that struggle is for the end of oppression in all forms, right? And sometimes we, like we feel like we have to make these choices. It's like, oh, let's support the Black man and protect him and lead him forward in emancipation, and then we'll get our turn, like as women later, right?
Yes.
Or, let's put forth, so I think what we're trying to get through now, and again, we have a language to talk about it now. It's like when we talk about intersectionality, when we talk about allyship, we have a better language to describe the way in which we can all move forward together, because the thing that we're trying to eliminate is systems of oppression that affect us all, right? They affects us differently, but that's only because there's a strategy of divide and conquer that is part of that. But if we see the truth of the system of oppression, where it's like, y'all, it's only trying to protect this 2% of wealthy white men over of a certain age, of a certain class, right, of which none of us are. And they're setting up the laws and structures to protect what they have. And if the laws and structures don't work, then they're going to have insurrection, and they're going to get it. They're not even going to be fighting, right? They're going to be like, you drink the Clorox bleach. And
exactly.
And go get your nails done, and we'll see you on the other side, right? So in that sense, if we, so my thing is like, I'm a product of the struggle. That means I'm always seeking out where's their oppression, and then what is it that I can do, what decision that I can make to eliminate oppression. And I always say, I try to make my decisions in terms of like identifying who's the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And if I create the conditions in which the most vulnerable feel that they have agency and empowerment and go forward, that normally means everyone else who may be at a lower scale of vulnerability, they get liberated too.
That's so powerful.
So I would say, if you liberate queer women or femme-identified, racialized people with disabilities and create the conditions in which they not only survive but can flourish in a society, you would pretty much eliminate all of the oppressive barriers, right?
Right. Let's get on it.
I'm trying.
We're doing the best we can, but yeah, thank you so much for asking questions and answering my questions.
Hey, that's called a conversation. That's even better than an interview.